Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I decided to do a somewhat different kind of discussion video. I have been struggling with reading a bit this month. I'm not in a slump, but because I've been struggling so much, I've been thinking a lot about reading slumps and trying to make sure I don't just wind up not reading for a month and a half because I don't want that to happen. So I decided it would be really interesting and potentially useful for some people to do a video on how to get out of a reading slump. I am a mood reader, so when I'm in the mood, I can read a lot, and when I'm not in the mood, I struggle with reading at all, and I know not everyone is like that, so if you're not a mood reader and you don't suffer from reading slumps and all that, and it's just a time concern for you, this might not be the most helpful video. This is just for the mood readers because that's what I experience. I also know a lot of these videos turn into book recommendations, and I will have a few recommendations, but I'm going to focus more on why you're in a reading slump and what specific book types you should gravitate towards to help you get out, because I find that more helpful to me than just random recommendations. So I've compiled a list of 7 reasons you might be struggling with reading and what kind of books you could potentially gravitate towards that might help you get more invested in your reading. The first reason I have on this list is a fairly obvious one. It's just that you've been reading a lot of mediocre or bad books, and because of that, they've just put you in a down mood and you haven't been that interested in picking up anything else. And it's hard to just continue on when you know you haven't been loving reading lately. And for this, my biggest recommendation is to reread an old favorite. That's what I do. And for me, that usually means Harry Potter or Tamora Pierce, something I read years ago, something I love to my very core. Just rereading something that you know you'll love can sort of bring back that spark and the interest you had, whereas these mediocre books are just dampening it. And if you're not a big rereading person, I would recommend potentially reading an author you love and trying one of their new books. When you already love the author and their style, oftentimes reading a new book from them can do the same thing as rereading an old favorite. My second reason is that you're feeling uninterested or bored in your reading. You're just looking at your shelves or looking at your TBR, and nothing really sounds interesting to you. It just sounds all the same. For this, I'd recommend going out to a used bookstore or your local library and picking out a book that is outside of your normal genres. If you're usually a big contemporary reader, try branching out into a little fantasy or science fiction or magical realism. If you read a lot of nonfiction, try some fiction. It's not necessarily about finding a new genre that you love so much as it is finding something different. Sometimes we get bored reading the same things, and even if you don't love the new things that you try, it can still bring in something unique and different. The third reason on this list is that you're burned out. We've all been there where either it's from a readathon, like booktubeathon, when you've just been reading as much as humanly possible and way too much for your own lifestyle, or if you've just been really into reading for a few weeks or a few months and you've just been reading an incredible number of books, and then you realize that your brain is kind of tired and you don't really feel like picking anything up. I do recommend just taking a break. Sometimes that's the best thing for it. You don't need to be constantly reading. It's okay to just watch a movie or sniff a flower or whatever it is that normal people who don't read all the time do. Just take a break from reading. Your brain does need a rest. Constantly reading it's not a bad thing, but sometimes your brain just gets exhausted and you just need to take a break for a while, whether it's a few days or a few weeks. Although I do have one recommendation if you don't necessarily want to take a break, you still want to read something. Try reading in a different format than you usually read. If you're usually big on reading physical books, try listening to an audiobook. If you usually read novels, try reading a graphic novel. If you usually read prose, try some poetry. Try reading in a different format so you're not just reading the same thing. Just experiencing the book in a different way can help your brain a lot, I think. Just give it the rest it needs while still consuming literature. Reason number 4 is similar to reason number 2 in that it's also feeling bored, but in a mentally unstimulated kind of way rather than an uninterested kind of way. Sometimes I get into these slumps where I just feel like the books don't make me think, and my brain is just bored of reading them. It's not necessarily that the books are bad, it's just sometimes my brain wants something a little more. And for this, I'd recommend try reading something that's a little bit more difficult, a little bit more thought-provoking, something that you have to work for. I often find that nonfiction, literary fiction, classics, some difficult high fantasy can work really well for this. Because sometimes your brain does just struggle for something to work on. This is one that I do have a couple of recommendations for. First, I would recommend The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, or any Margaret Atwood book. She's a really lovely literary fiction writer. The Handmaid's Tale is the most popular of her work. There's the show on Netflix. But with her writing, you always have to work to keep up with her. My second recommendation is Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. This is a very difficult high fantasy novel that deals a lot with politics and many, many characters. Just in that regard, you do have to work a lot and think a lot and focus on the story to keep up. Also, The Lost by Daniel Mendelsohn. This is a nonfiction book about a man's journey to discover what happened to his family during the Holocaust. He has a very circular writing style that's really beautiful to read and really engaging, but you do have to constantly be focused on what he's saying and what he said in the previous paragraphs, because you can get lost very easily. And my final recommendation for this is The Magic Toy Shop by Angela Carter. This is a young adult magical realism book that's really dark and really twisted, and it very much falls into the literary fiction category, but because it's so short and because it's young adult, I feel like this might be not an easier book to understand, but more in people's typical genres, because it's so creepy and dark, and the underlying themes can be not a difficult read, but you do have to work for them. Reason number 5 is the inverse of that, and that is you're feeling mentally exhausted. Your brain has been working too hard, and all of the books that are on your shelves just sound so tiring to read. For this, I'd recommend try reading something a little bit easier. You don't have to be constantly working for a book to be worth it. You can read something that's a little bit lighter. For this, I'd recommend books that are more in the romance or thriller genre, something that's just a fun, easy ride, but isn't necessarily a whole lot of work. I also have recommendations for this one. The first is The Truth About Forever by Sarah Dessen. This is a really cute, really sweet, young adult contemporary romance. It's just a fun read, and it's always really easy and quick to get through. And a thriller author that I do think is incredibly easy to read is Lisa Gardner. This is Find Her, which is one of my favorites of her books. But in general, I just find her books to be a really easy read, but also a fun ride, and they're just entertaining till the end. And for some adult contemporary, I have One Day by David Nichols. This is a romance novel that takes place over the course of one day over 20 years. And it's a really interesting concept and just such a lovely read, even if it can be a little bit sad at times. Reason number 6 is you don't know what you feel like. You're not feeling negative towards any of the books on your shelves. It's just that none of them appeal to you. And for this, I'd recommend trying the first chapter challenge, which I've seen a lot around BookTube for various readathons. But basically, the first chapter challenge is you pull a few books off your shelves at random and just read the first chapter of them. I find that when I read the first chapter, sometimes one book doesn't appeal to me, but another will, and I don't necessarily know what I'm feeling like reading, but I know it when I read it. And just experiencing what you want when you don't know it can really, really help. And my final reason is probably my biggest problem with reading slumps, and that is you're just feeling lazy. You want to read, you have the time to read, it's just easier to sit there and watch a Netflix show. This is something I do struggle with quite a bit, just because reading can be a lot of work at times, regardless of how difficult or easy the writing is. One thing I do to help this is that I set reading goals. I'm not a big, organized, planned reader. I don't usually stick to these goals for long periods of time, but you can. I do know quite a few people who have specific reading goals that are very organized and very detailed, and they stick to them for long periods of time. If you're interested in stuff like that, I'd really recommend checking out Shannon Riddler. I will link her channel down below, but she has a lot of specific challenges, and she tracks her reading really well and really thoroughly. So I feel like watching her channel would be like a really good help if you're trying to get more into that. But what I do is just I set goals for short periods of time. Based on what I'm doing with my life, I'll decide that I should be reading 100 pages a day. Because for me, that's usually a fairly realistic goal that I do have to work towards, but I often have the time to do it. I just am too lazy. So I'll set a goal, and I'll make sure I meet that goal. And usually if I've done that for a day or a couple of days, I get back into the habit of reading more regularly. And once I'm reading regularly, I don't feel as lazy because it's something that I'm already doing. It's harder to start doing something than it is to continue doing it, which is why starting out with reading goals helps me a lot. And I do have one kind of small final bonus point, and that is mental health issues. I know I personally struggle with depression and anxiety, and I know a lot of people have their own issues, mental health and physical health, or just personal problems in life that they're dealing with. Obviously, you should focus on yourself over your reading, and it's okay to take some time off. It's okay to not be reading constantly. I hope someone has found something interesting in this. I don't know how helpful this would be for other people, but for me, identifying why I'm struggling with reading is often more helpful than anything else. I hope you've gained something from watching this. Let me know down below what your favorite methods for getting out of reading slumps are. There's no possible way to cover everything, and a lot of these can be mixed together and you can have a combination of these, but these are just some basic points that I've discovered over the years of reading. As always, thank you so much for watching and commenting. I love to hear from you guys, and I will see you guys again soon. Bye!